maybe some things should just stay buried. Hey everyone, this is Movieman, fellow cinephile, popcorn addict, and emerging film critic, coming to you with reliable recaps, reviews, and reactions, and I am coming to you all once again with my out of the theater, in the theater thoughts. This time for tonight's AMC Scream Unseen, We Bury the Dead, written and directed by Zak Hilditch, starring Daisy Ridley, Mark Cole-Smith, and Brenton Thwaites. Story-wise, this film is centered around a young woman who goes in search of her missing husband, amidst the dawning of an apocalypse of the undead. So first and foremost, let me just say that considering that the zombie subgenre, when it comes to horror, they've never quite been my jam. I will say the two exceptions to that rule have been Pet Sematary by Stephen King and Handling the Undead by Jon Ajvide Lindqvist. Anything outside of that, like The Walking Dead or Danny Boyle's 28, films, and the list goes on, they've not really been for me. Maybe Warm Bodies, that was another exception. But outside of that, these films and these stories have never really worked for me. And I think what the two stories I mentioned, and even with those, I'm more so referring to the books rather than the films, although the films are fine. But I think what makes those stories work so much for me is that they really delve deep into how the undead really are a metaphor for unresolved grief, loss, and the inability of the living to really contend with that, and the greater consequences of being unable to, make peace and heal and go forward. When it comes down to that infamous quote, sometimes dead is better, it doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. It does mean what you think it means, but it has a much deeper meaning as well. And so I think given this particular story, it is attempting to delve into the same dynamics, and ultimately it is about what it means to have to deal again with, a zombie apocalypse, basically, the end of days and just the world shifting as a result of something in the air. I would simply say that. I don't even want to spoil that piece of it. But I think that what I can say is that Daisy Ridley, much like many of the talented actors, John Boyega, Oscar Isaac, and the list goes on, that got done so dirty by Disney within the Star Wars trilogy. If people enjoy it, that's awesome. I appreciate some of the ideas, but listen, it's not a satisfactory follow-up to those films. It's just not. And ultimately, I think the biggest problem is just how much of a waste there was regarding how the talent was handled and the story and so many other things. But anyway, I would say with Daisy Ridley, I have seen her in so many films post Ray that I really enjoyed. I think she's very talented, and I hope she really gets her due as time goes on, because I don't know if she's really seen as the talent that she is. And I think that her performance obviously was a focal point here, and I really did appreciate the intensity she brought. And a lot of it wasn't just obviously over the top theatrics or anything like that, but a lot of it were the subtleties and having to contend with this unresolved dynamic between herself and her husband, just the subtle unresolved feelings that she has as she's going through this experience. And then in addition to that, we have Brenton Thwaites, who is another character who ends up crossing paths with her on this journey. And I was so confused at first, because I was just like, first of all, this guy looks like Josh Hartnett with long hair and, a mustache and, semi-goatee, all of that. And I was like, but I know that's not Josh Hartnett. It kind of looks like the actor who portrayed Prince Philip in Maleficent, and I was right. He was in the Pirates of the Caribbean film Dead Men Tell No Tales, and he also portrayed Nightwing in Titans. But I think the two of them together was really solid. And then, of course, we have a very interesting dynamic shift that happens with the two of them as well. I think that the ideas here work in theory. I think it's filmed beautifully. I think it has a lot of intensity. We know how zombies are, but there are just some moments, not necessarily with loud movements and a whole lot going on. But there were some moments to me that genuinely chilled me because I was just like, ooh, okay. Just the visuals of it and there were just some really unsettling images here. And I appreciated all of that. I appreciated that we were willing to get down in the nitty gritty as far as the violence and, a little bit of violence here and there. It wasn't necessarily the worst violence I've ever seen, but it didn't necessarily hold back either. So I did appreciate that. Jumping over into the cons, I just think that this film feels so derivative. And it's not trying to be, but I think for all its interesting and unique, somewhat original ideas, it to me pulls too easily from what we've already seen. I feel like if you're going to do something involving the undead, you have to give us some more ideas and some more concepts and, just have an execution that feels all the more original. It's kind of the same thing I was saying about The Housemaid, where it's just like, we know how this goes. We know what the formula is, but I still felt within that there were some, oh, okay, cool. I wasn't necessarily expecting all that. Jumping over to the end and the structure and all of that, I just felt like the film was very disjointed and very unfocused. And ultimately coming down to it, I know what it was trying to say. I also don't know what it was trying to say. And I think that was an issue for me. It's the same way I felt about the film adaptations of Handling the Undead and Pet Sematary. It's fine, it works, but a lot of that emotional depth and intensity that is present in the source material in the original novel and definitely hit me hard, that's not there. So it made it feel like, sure, fine, but no at the same time. It's just something about it felt unresolved and unfocused and unclear. And I think it's interesting because they raised the question in the film that sometimes the idea of what happens with the undead in this film is that perhaps it comes from this idea of something being unfinished, which is so ironic because I felt like the film, ultimately, with me walking away from it, it felt very much unfinished. It's not the worst way to kick off 2026, but it's not necessarily a film that is reinventing the wheel, and it doesn't have to, but I think I'm always looking for new ideas, even if it's being done within a genre or a subgenre with characters and ideas we've seen before. You gotta know how to push it a little bit further, and I think that this is promising, but did it necessarily live up to the excitement I had for this, especially based off the trailer? Nah. We Bury the Dead will be released in theaters January 2nd. You all feel free to check it out, leave your thoughts below, and let me know what you think. So, once again, this is D, Movieman, signing off, and I'll see you at the movies.